Lesson 3, Understanding Contracts and Escrow, our Scenario 1, Property Transaction. Take 15 minutes and read Scenario 1 and answer the questions by selecting the best answer. When you have completed all 5 parts, return here and unpause your computer, and I'll go over the answers with you. Scenario 1, Part 1, brand new real estate broker working at OnTrack. You have a buyer, client Gary, who is interested in finding an older home in an established neighborhood. What they're going to ask you is, what kinds of things should you discuss with your client, Gary, and perhaps even your managing broker at this point? Since you're a new agent, you may need to talk to your managing broker. The best responses are 1, the commission agreements between all parties. Very important to discuss that. 4, Gary's motivation for purchasing property. Important to know seller's motivation as well as buyer's motivation to help them go through the process and to help them accomplish what their goals are. And you're only going to know that unless you ask them. So what's their motive for purchasing property? 5, we might want to discuss other locations that might suit Gary's needs and wants too. Always good to have a backup property or two that might be hanging out there. It's also to your clients, in this case buyers' best interest, that you have some alternatives. It gives you a little more leverage in the transaction if you've got a couple of properties that might suit your needs and wants. 6, we need to know if Gary's going to bring earnest money to the table, how much is that going to be as he goes forward with any transaction. And then lastly, the financing arrangements Gary's willing to consider, because that ultimately most real estate transactions have some kind of financing involved with them. So we need to discuss financing, or better, when we have some idea what that might be an issue, we'll send them down to our local mortgage broker that we work with and let our mortgage broker discuss with him all of the different financing arrangements that he might be considering. So typically it's a good idea to send them down, your buyer clients down, and get pre-qualified with a lender. Scenario 2 looks like he wants to make an offer, which would probably include some provisions for financing as well. As we look over our contract and we get prepared to present this, we're not quite sure what to do. So we might want to consult with our managing broker, being that Ivy, who is the seller's agent, apparently isn't going to be available for us. So what do we do when we've got a buyer that wants to make an offer and the seller's agent isn't available? The best response is, let me call my managing broker, Gary, and ask why your offer can't be presented. And since the seller has not accepted any other offers, we need to talk to the managing broker at Premier, and you wouldn't call the managing broker. Your managing broker would call Premier's managing broker and say, hey, we have an offer we want to present. How can we get that done? And I'm sure the managing broker will do everything in his power, including if he has to go and present it himself, if the listing agent isn't available. You want those offers, and you're duty bound to present those offers as quickly as you can. So the managing broker at the listing office is going to find a solution for you. After hearing from the managing broker, Ivy does present Gary's offer. Now, if we're in Ivy's shoes, what would be appropriate for Ivy to discuss with her seller's client? Well, Ivy ought to discuss the pros and cons of that offer and any other offers that might be there. And then she can either accept one of the offers or make a counter offer on one or both of the offers, or reject both offers. So you can be negotiating a couple of contracts at one time, Mr. Seller or Miss Buyer, whoever it might be. Just remember that You only want to sign one of those counteroffers and be notified of that acceptance, because that will create a contract. You don't want two sales contracts, but you certainly can negotiate a number of contracts. The sellers looked at offers and wants to consider making a counteroffer to Gary and to the other buyer. And so the seller consults with Ivy and his listing agent. What information would be helpful for them to understand in order to prepare the counteroffers on both of these? Well, number 2 would be important. The time frame requirement for closing, that may be important to Gary and other buyers. How's the closing date work between these two competing buyers? Is one more desirable than the other? 3, whether or not either buyer is interested in other properties for sale. You need to know our competition. Sellers, the negotiating strategy may be when it comes to any contract concessions. Are we willing, or is our seller willing to grant any contract concessions as you're negotiating? Because maybe those contract concessions might be important to one buyer, maybe not so important to another buyer. 5, any time frames indicated in the offers relating to presenting a counteroffer. So if we start negotiating, is one going to ask for a week to think it over, and the other one is maybe willing to get back within 24 hours? Time is of the essence. So that's time frames are important for you to be looking at with these counteroffers. And then lastly, any details about each buyer's financial position, especially if the offer involves owner financing. So we'll want to know about the buyers that are negotiating on seller's property, what their financial position is. Maybe one's all cash, so that's very desirable. Maybe one has got their financing lined up. They have a letter of acceptance, if you will, and or maybe they don't have financing lined up, but they would like maybe the owner to finance them. That happens occasionally too. So the details on the financing are very important. Consult with your buyer as one of the parties is discussing the steps. And whenever we get into contractual difficulties and contractual problems, the thing we need to do is take our sellers or our buyers and have them talk to their legal counsel. We never want to be, and I will stress, never want to be involved in giving any sort of legal advice, whether we think a contract is or isn't void, or whether they are or aren't liable, or what they should do from a legal perspective. Okay, that's the province of real estate attorneys. That's what they're hired to do. The elements of a valid contract, maybe to review again what we need in order to perfect a valid contract. If there was a disagreement between a seller and a buyer and it ended up in a court, this is what the court would be looking at. The items that we will you'll see as a blue X. These are the elements that a court would be looking at to make sure it's present so we have a valid contract. A court would not care about an acknowledgement by an officer of the court. In other words, having any sort of notary seal on a contract doesn't make it valid. It doesn't make it a contract. Having a closing date, not important to the validity of a contract. Consideration, yeah. We need to have consideration to bind the contract. Court's going to look for what's the consideration. Love and affection, money, what is it? Contractual capacity, very important for the court to determine the legal capacity, the mental capacity of a seller and a buyer to even enter into a contract. And was there any fraud? Was there any misrepresentation? Or were either of them under the influence of drugs or alcohol? Did they both have their mental faculties when they created this contract? Very important, because that'll determine whether or not the contract is valid, void, or voidable. Earnest money deposit, not necessary. Court doesn't really care about that. That's strictly a contractual negotiating item. Escape clauses, no. Financing contingencies, not important to the validity of the contract. It be in writing, very important. If the contract isn't in writing, the court will just sort of tell everybody to go home. Lawful and possible objective. Yeah, the contract has to contemplate a legal purpose. It can't be for something against the law. The liquidated damages instructions are not important for the validity of the contract. Might important after the contract has been adjudicated for either the plaintiff or to the defendant, but not as far as whether or not it's a valid, void, or avoidable contract. Meeting of the minds, that is important. The court will want to know that both parties acted under, were not acting under duress, that they knew what was in the minds and the hearts of the other party, and that no one tried to defraud them or misrepresent them or cheat them or, in any other way mislead them. Minimum services, court doesn't care what the minimum services are offered by the real estate firm. Property description must have some kind of property description so we know what the subject matter was of that contract. So that's going to be very important to the validity of the contract. Recording in the public record, not important. And signatures of both parties, yes. Okay, they must acknowledge after we have our meeting of the minds and after we have all the other elements of the valid contract, we have to have both parties sign the contract. Okay, continue on to the terminology review for lesson 3.